Hi, Peter.
Hello, Serge.
So you're a focusing-oriented therapist, and you pay a lot of attention to the felt sense. You also wrote a book about neuroscience for therapists. And today we're going to be talking about the felt sense from a perspective of neuroscience.
Right. Great. So let me say something about that. I have come to the understanding that the felt sense is, if you like, the essential activity of the right hemisphere of our brains much of the time, and that it's normally present, present in that side of our brains, and it's sort of going on all the time. Now, there are exceptions to that. For example, when we're highly emotional, then we don't have felt sense. So understanding the felt sense this way means understanding a little bit about the right hemisphere, which is completely different from the left hemisphere. And that's already a problem, because we all try to understand the right hemisphere in the first place from the perspective of the left. And
let me stop a little bit, because that's something that's very important there. We're talking about the felt sense as sensed with the right hemisphere, and you made the very important caveat that it exists within a certain bandwidth, that when there is too much emotion, then it's not present. And I think that maybe there is a confusion for some people that just felt sense is something that happens all the time, and that's really circumscribed to that bandwidth.
Well, I would argue that, yes, actually, I think a lot of people who, for instance, people in the focusing world who use the term felt sense a lot, consider the felt sense to be something that is present when they turn attention inside into their felt experiencing in the body, and may not think of it as something that's present much of the time as they go about their life and work and everything. But I think it is.
Okay. Yeah.
And we could go back to Gendlin there, because Gendlin, the way Gendlin writes about the felt sense, he says it forms when we take our attention inside and into the body. And I prefer to think of a little, to rerun that as it's already present in the right hemisphere, but it takes a moment or two for the left hemisphere to sort of tune into it when we take our attention in that direction. And that's why Gendlin talks about the felt sense forming inside.
So it's a little bit of like that koan about what happens when a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody to hear it. In that case, the tree falls in the forest, but it's perceived when we turn our attention to it.
Yes, yes. Yep. So for something to happen in the human domain, we need both sides of the brain.
Yeah.
But the felt sense in the right hemisphere may be guiding us a lot of the time without an explicit awareness of it, the sort of explicit awareness we have in inner practices like focusing, is my belief.
Yeah, yeah.
And the little more of the neuroscience background to that, while the left hemisphere is paying attention to whatever we're doing, like what we're saying, what I want to say, or what I'm reading, or what I'm hearing. The right hemisphere is aware, and aware in a broader sense of myself, my body, my environment, everything around me. And all of that is going on in the background. And my right hemisphere is weaving together my inner world and my outer world to keep them lined up and in sync all the time. And it does that automatically without our having to think a whole lot about it. But when we turn our attention inside, as we do in practices like focusing, then that background activity becomes more foreground, and we call that felt sense, in the moment experiencing of the here and now.
Yeah, so that the left hemisphere is more focused attention,
That's
and
right.
the right hemisphere is a sense of context.
Well, to do with context, because it's a broader attention, such that if something unexpected happens around us, then our attention will be diverted towards it, or will very probably be diverted towards it, because it's possible, particularly for some people, to be so focused on what they're doing, some work they're doing, that they don't notice things happening around them. And sometimes they maybe need somebody to say, hey, come on, did you hear this or see that? And their mind has been set, our minds can get into that sort of tunnel vision state.
Yeah. And so in a sense, that brings us to also a different definition of mindfulness, which is mindfulness is not necessarily the mind being laser focused, but actually if we include both hemispheres, it would be that capacity to integrate both.
Yes, because we broaden our awareness out, so we can be aware of more than the immediate focus of our attention, and it can be inward as well as outward. So we think of our senses as being our five senses. They're all outward senses, but we also have an inner sense, and science calls this interoception, and that's the sense of the body from within. So that includes all the organs in the body. Think of the heart and lungs and the gut and blood and hormones going on inside. All the complexity of the physiological body is sensed by the right hemisphere. And if we become aware of that, when we become aware of that, we might call that felt sense.
Yeah. So that's the component of all this information from the five senses that are tuned to the outside, and the inner sensing, interoception, and that provides a composite picture of who you are and how you stand with the world.
Yes, I think for clarity, I would tend to say the five senses are alongside rather than part of that. What comes into us from the five senses, of course, becomes part of the felt sense, what we register. But the felt sense is particularly this inner sense, in interoception. And what's happening in the body, of course, is very often a response to what's happening around us. For example, what's happening in my body now changes from when I'm speaking to when I'm listening to you speaking.
Yeah. So that's a very good transition from the notion of interoception as a concept to the practical application of what happens when we pay attention to the felt sense.
Yes.
Being able to notice these relatively subtle changes that would pass unnoticed if we were not paying attention.
Yeah, they could well pass unnoticed. Yes. And then the wonderful thing is, of course, the felt sense comes to us as one inner experience, one felt sense. Actually, feeding into it are probably a multitude of things happening inside. But fortunately, our clever brains don't deluge us with all the detail. They give us a feeling for how we are, and a feeling for the present situation, and whether I like this present situation or I don't like this present situation, or something doesn't feel quite right about this situation, or hey, this does feel right, I like it, let's go.
Yeah. And so when you describe it this way, it's very clear that it evolved as something that is action oriented. That is how we are in the world. And obviously, what is it that I could do? Or without knowing how we are in the world, we couldn't decide
Yes.
what is that we might want to do.
Well, I think that's, I go along with you there and saying, yes, it's action oriented, because our nervous systems have evolved for us to act. Of course, they've also evolved for us to rest and sleep, which is very, very important. And then we're not acting exactly, are we? We're asleep. But when we're awake, we are acting, or we are preparing to act, I guess. Maybe we are acting all the time. I'd have to think about that, acting in some kind of way. That's what the nervous system is doing all the time. So the holistic, putting the inner world and the outer world together, that happens in the right hemisphere, and that is the ground for our experience of the felt sense. It makes sense to think of this leads towards action.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the basis for action. I suppose perhaps sometimes what do you think about this? Sometimes we act without that connectedness with the felt sense, and then things don't go so well. Like I might do something, I say, well, actually, I was very uncentered. I was off center. I wasn't feeling I was in my body. I didn't feel grounded, and so what I did wasn't so good. And so I need to get grounded again, so that my next action is going to come more from the center.
Yeah, yeah. And so when you're describing it that way, the concept of being grounded is the concept of actually being in touch with that holistic sense that our right hemisphere has formed based on information filtered from the outside through the nervous system and inner information, the interoception. So essentially being grounded means being in touch with what happens organically in terms of orienting to the world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They all go together, don't they?
Yeah.
And in this right hemisphere world, everything is interrelated in a way that is not true of the left hemisphere world. So that's one wonderful thing about the brain. The left hemisphere can break the world down into component parts, so the right hemisphere keeps it all together as a whole. So if I'm centered, I'm probably grounded as well. And if I have, when I have access to my felt sense, then I need to be grounded. It helps to be grounded to find the felt sense, bring it into awareness. And probably if I sit with my felt sense for a time, as we do in focusing, for example, then I will feel grounded. I maybe come to feel more grounded as I do that. They all go together.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So there's something about bringing some intentionality to being in a sensing mode, which means paying attention to the way the right brain operates. Sensing, which also involves sensing inner information, and how this in turns makes us more grounded. And the experience of being more grounded helps us also be more connected. So we kind of get into that virtuous cycle.
Yeah, yeah. Now, my belief is rather that we're all different, and some people may be naturally grounded and centered and speaking, acting, interacting from the felt sense without the sort of deliberate sensing inside that people like you and I do a lot of. Some people may be like that. Of course, lots of time, it's very easy to find examples of people not being like that. But I think what we're talking about here is a natural human capacity that happens automatically when things are going well. But we know in human affairs and human lives that a lot of the time they don't go well. And then that natural capacity is diminished or is lost to some extent.
Yeah. So that essentially this might be more a sense of, with civilized life, for many of us, there is a need to have that intentionality to activate something that is an organic part of functioning.
Yeah, it really helps, doesn't it, to do that? Yeah. Which is why we do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So where does this lead us to now?
Yeah. So when you ask this question, we take a pause, which is kind of what we do in focusing. Take a moment, take a pause, and then, something happens.
Mm-hmm.
And that something often manifests as a felt sense.
Mm-hmm.
So in some way, we're practicing what we preach. We're demonstrating this in this conversation.
Yeah. This is so important, to allow there to be pauses. So we don't just have to, or we shouldn't even just be speaking continually. This triggers something for me. I had a little experience this morning. I was walking up my local street to go to my nearest London tube station to go into central London. And I walked past a young woman who was talking on her mobile phone, or you call them cell phones. And what I noticed was she was talking all the time. She didn't stop. And it took me, I was only walking a little faster than her. So I was hearing her for quite a period of time. And in that time, there was no break in her talking. And I thought, this is strange. Presumably there's somebody on the other end of her call listening to her, but she just babbled. And I thought, this is a very common experience. When I hear people talking on their mobile phones, I may be like this myself. There isn't a sense of a nice back and forward conversation. There's just this stream, verbal stream, and that doesn't feel great. I feel a bit worried. That sort of thing. But we need to pause. And one of the things that happens in pausing, of course, is, as you say, a new felt sense can arise. There's also the process of things, of what's been going on, like what we've been saying so far, going in, sort of being digested, going into the whole of our mind inside, which really means the right hemisphere, all the reverberations inside our mind, and the feedback from the body, which is an intrinsic part of that. And we need that to happen to have creative, useful felt senses.
Yeah. And so how does this manifest in therapy? How do you,
right?
So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, we do this in therapy, don't we? As therapists, we're trained, I hopefully, to use both sides of our brain. So while I give focused attention to what my client is saying, and follow the details and follow the story and follow the content, I'm also giving some space to my right hemisphere, which is looking at the bigger picture. So that means noticing things about the client, like their body language, their manner of speaking, my sense of their connectedness and centeredness in the way they're speaking, the coherence of the story that they're telling me, and my awareness of my felt response, how I feel listening to this person telling me whatever they're telling me. So I'm using both my focused awareness and my broad awareness, and allowing myself to have a felt sense of the whole of our interaction, not just what the client is saying, but how it feels for this person and me to be sitting here having our therapeutic dialogue.
Yeah, yeah. And so as you describe it this way, there's something that explicitly you're describing the process of paying attention to information from both hemispheres and allowing that information to integrate so that there is a view of the situation as a whole. Implicitly, what you've also said is that unlike other approaches to therapy where, say, it's defined by what you do with the client, what procedure you might be using. It is conceivable to be a focusing-oriented therapist by having this focusing approach, being a therapist, without necessarily having specific focusing interventions with the client.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the way I like to work. Now, you see, without specific focusing interventions, of course, to my mind, there are a very wide range of focusing interventions we can use, because there are ways of saying something back in the dialogue or of suggesting something that are encouraging and supporting of the client's, well, the therapist and the client's awareness of the felt sense behind, under or underneath what's being said. So certain ways of phrasing something like, well, this word something that we use a lot in focusing, putting the word something into a reflection to the client. This is a very simple but incredibly useful technique, if you want to call it a technique or an intervention, or you want to call it an intervention, but it's a way of speaking that helps us to have a conversation that is grounded in, centered in both of our felt senses. We've talked about there's something happening here. There's something you're feeling. There's something I'm feeling. And we don't have to immediately decide what that something is, but we can point our attention towards that something.
Yeah, so that's a way to point without framing it in a way that narrows it down, but actually something, it invites an opening, it invites curiosity. There's something I'm noticing, or there's something happening. That's something. Yeah.
And that's pointing at the right hemisphere world, because that's what the right hemisphere comes up with. Hey, there's something here. And then what we learn to do as therapists is to, and we maybe learn this explicitly over here in our left hemispheres, is to take that sense of something seriously and do something about it, act on it, rather than just say, oh, well, there was something there and let it drift away, but to pick up on it.
Right, right. So it's not just a curiosity of, oh yeah, there's something happening, moving on, but it's actually an entry point.
Yes, an entry point to a new world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There's a lovely quote from Maturana and Varela, if some of your listeners know these writers. They say, every reflection brings forth a world.
Mm.
And I love that very
Yeah.
simple statement. It's a new world comes forth every time we allow ourselves to reflect, take our time, pause, and speak from the felt sense, allow something new to come into our awareness and to maybe find words for it, or not necessarily words, of course, some other form of self-expression.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And so in some way you're describing the DNA of the work, the sense of something that's part of the structure, that the therapist being in that mode of engaging the right hemisphere as well as the left one is able to notice those little somethings and draw attention to them with the client. And drawing attention to them is not just drawing attention to something, but is actually engaging the client in working with the right hemisphere.
Yeah.
And so that's how the process is drawn to that right hemisphere kind of processing.
Yes, we're encouraging and supporting the client to open up his or her right hemisphere world,
Mm-hmm.
which is there somewhere, even if people appear to be very cut off, very disconnected, it's somewhere there. It'll appear sooner or later, and that natural process of reflection, of a light level of what Jonathan called focusing, can happen,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
support that happening without having to do a big technique called focusing or anything else.
Yeah, yeah. And even without necessarily using the word felt sense, because in the way you describe it, you say there's something, and the something is neutral enough that it doesn't require any prior knowledge of what a felt sense might be.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I find myself sometimes sitting with my clients and wondering, well, shall I use the term felt sense or not? Do I want to or not? And I'm not quite sure about it because I don't need to. I can talk about a sense or a feeling or an intuition, use normal words like that. And they have hopefully have the desired effect. And I don't want to get technical with my clients, use a technical term, because sometimes I think in teaching focusing, felt sense is a technical term, and learn what we mean by this term. But on the other hand, just the words felt sense conveys something to anyone. And maybe if we bring it more into normal speech, that would be good. It would point everyone's attention more towards the felt sense. And I've heard some people sometimes get a bit picky about, oh, this person's using the term felt sense in the wrong way. They don't really understand it. And they may have a point there, but in their using the phrase felt sense, maybe they're headed in the right direction. Better to be using it than not using it and not knowing anything about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that it indicates that there is something about that kind of perception. Yes.
Yeah,
That so it's a
yeah,
way to direct people to have some curiosity that there is something there to explore called the
yeah,
felt sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So maybe therapists who haven't been trained in focusing and learned what Jolene says about the felt sense and all that, maybe they use the term felt sense. Maybe one day they'll stop and say, oh, what do I mean when I say felt sense? Maybe better go back to basics and just see what I might. Well, of course, definition. You see, people want a definition of the felt sense, but it's one of the wonderful things about this concept is you can't define it. It evades the definition, which I think is great, because of course it's the left hemisphere that loves to define things precisely, but the right hemisphere isn't bothered to do that at all.
Yeah.
Just uses language that feels like it's sort of it's an apt description of a felt experience. The right hemisphere is perfectly happy with that.
Yeah, yeah. Or if it can be described as a process, like something that happens or something that you notice when you pay attention to your inner world.
Yeah, yeah. And it is a process, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Process is another word I keep wondering about, because I remember a long time ago when I got involved with humanistic psychology in the early 1980s, people kept using this word process. There's a process here. We're going to do a process. And after one or two weekend workshops with all these processes, we all got fed up with the word process. But here we are years later, and we're using the word process. And well, there's obviously a good reason for that. And Jenlin's philosophical work is called a process model. The right hemisphere is a process. It's a work in progress, a work in process, a process in process, in a way that the left hemisphere and the left hemisphere want to pin things down and make it concrete and definite, which is great. We need both.
And so as you're talking in these terms, I'm wondering if maybe one way to describe what we do in focusing oriented therapy is putting the client more in touch with that process. And that, in a sense, we're allowing the process to carry forward, as the phrase that people use in focusing, but to continue by having some attention put on it and removing the obstacles that come from not being in touch with it, but essentially allowing the process to go on.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Allowing there to be a process. And see, one way I do that, and I'm probably you do it, and everyone does it in a therapy session, is to invite the client to have a thought, have a feeling, have an image, and then say it's fine if you don't have one. And it's sort of it's a paradoxical intervention. We invite something into the space here, and if it's not ready to come, that's fine. So I'm always telling my clients to, in some way, to work. Don't work so hard. Don't try and figure this out. Let's not look for a solution. Let's not look to an answer to the problem, which of course can be, have to be careful, because that can be very annoying to people. Somebody comes to me and they want an answer to their problem, don't they? So I better deliver or I'll be in trouble. But of course, I know that if I just deliver an answer, that's not going to help, is it? So I try to respond a little bit to that part of it. And of course, that's the client's left hemisphere speaking like that. And then encourage them to slow down and stop looking for answers and solutions and all that, so that process can happen, so that they make space in their minds for their right hemisphere contribution to come in there, which will be a process of, of some kind. I think there are many, obviously many ways that that right hemisphere process manifests in therapy. The process within one session, within one therapeutic hour, and the process from the session 1 week to the session next week, and the process over a longer period of time.
Right. So that sense of the therapist recognizing that there is a flow of this process, and that's more of a dance with that flow than just directing it in a willful way.
Yes, that's the way I like to work, and I suppose a lot of therapists these days are trained to work in that more willful way. Well, I don't have to do that now. The way I work, I'm free to work as I want to. Yes, I had another thought there. It's somewhere over here. I just lost it a moment. That went with this. Anyway. Maybe if you continue, then it'll come. That thought will come back to me.
So one thing that you were saying a little before, I wanted to recast in a slightly different way to see. You were talking about with a client that sense of when introducing the notion of felt sense and pay attention and you do it, and if you don't, it's okay. If you don't find anything, it's okay. What came up for me is that sense of it could be put in the context of, on the one hand, creating safety. That say if the client has questions, say, well, you know what, I can't really deal with this unless you tell me more about what the felt sense is. You're going to do just as much as give safety, but you're going to also be very careful about not doing too much, because there is a great value in staying with the unknown as opposed to plugging in knowledge or information. And so essentially, it felt like there was a good description of that atmosphere, that balance between safety and uncertainty, unknown, without which the process, is stopped.
Yes. So maybe enough certainty that for the client to feel safe and have some idea of what's going to happen, and paradoxically, in having that, then you open up the time and space for what is unknown and what is uncertain, so that there's space for something to happen, which it will happen sooner or later. And I know the thought that went off over here, it was about going back to process, for the therapist to have trust that there is a process, even when there seems like there is not a process. So
it's a very big point. For the therapist to trust that there is a process, even when there doesn't seem to be a process. Yeah.
If the client seems to be stuck in one place and going round in circles, nevertheless, something is happening in the client, and at some point there will be some opening somewhere which will start to carry their experience forward.
Yeah.
And that,
so,
I think that merges.
So what feels really important there is that, saying a statement like trust that there is a process, even when there doesn't seem to be one, could seem to be some kind of a mystical statement, but the beauty of it is that with the focusing approach, there is actually a means to translate it into action by paying attention to felt experience. So it's not just that it will happen, but that pragmatically, if we pay attention to felt experience, then felt experience is going to shift the process.
Yes. If the client takes an interest in his or her inner world, he or she will discover things in time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And there are many ways to put that, aren't there? And you use the word mystical there. Well, you can see why people regard it as this as a mystical phenomenon. And personally, I'm quite happy with that. And I'm also happy with describing that sort of experience in neuroscience terms, from what I've learned about how our brains work from reading all these books on neuroscience on my shelves. And that's I find that very interesting, very rewarding.
Yeah.
To do that, because there is a neuroscience picture about it, and it's not a reductionist. I don't think it's reductionist, because actually if you go into the brain, what's happening, you're dealing with this extraordinarily complex, biologically complex thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Called the brain and the nervous system, and it's utterly fascinating, and we only know a little bit about it.
Yeah, yeah. So is this a good place to end, or do you want to add something?
Mm-hmm. Well, you started off with this conversation, or are talking about having this conversation about interaction, and so interaction is, there is some interaction all the time in there, and we can think of interaction between brain and body, mind and body. That's happening all the time. Interaction between the two hemispheres, and they're very different worlds that Ian McGilchrist describes so well. And there's always interaction between what's happening inside us, in body and mind, and the world around us. And I've just been reading a book about sleep, Why We Sleep, by Matthew Walker. Very, very good book on the subject, and talking about the different the distinctions between triggers to insomnia, things that trigger insomnia or may lead to insomnia, that are environmental, and the sort of factors that tend to lead to what would medically be termed insomnia. So all of this, it's all going on the time. So there you are, I've said my piece.
Great. Thanks, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Serge. It was very enjoyable to talk like this. It's nice to have a conversation in this kind of way.
Yeah, yeah, thanks.